Welcome to Thursday Book Club. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. For anyone new, and there are quite a few new people today, just a brief introduction to me before I introduce you to our guest, Yuan Yang. My name's Suzanne Leal, and I'm the author of six novels, most recently The Year We Escaped and The Watchful Wife. Many of you will know that one of my books came out on the day the world went into lockdown, which, Yuan, as you might imagine, is not great for publicity. So, as a way of reaching out to a community, I started this online book club there and then, really, in 2020, and it's grown into a gentle, intelligent, and supportive community. So I'm delighted that here we are again, 5 years on. Um, as you all know who've reached this, you can go to my website, suzanneleal.com, to sign up for the weekly book club and also to be part of interviews. But now to my guest. It is so, so lovely to have you as my guest, Yuan Yang. We have, and welcome. Welcome
Thank you.
to you
Thank
in
you for having me.
sunny London from rainy Sydney.
It's rainy Reading right now, actually. It's extremely
Ah,
rainy, unfortunately.
welcome to you in rainy Reading from raining Sydney. We have, for those of you who don't know, and I'm talking to you, Anne, as well, we have a mutual friend who's here tonight, and her name is Shinran. She's very well known in the literary community, and I stayed with Shinran earlier this year. And as writers do, part of our outings were going to bookshops, and she picked up this new book, newish book, which was called Private Revolutions, and looks something like this. And she said, "You've got to read this. It's the most fantastic book. It's about China. It's really needed and it's terrific." And then she said, "And you need to interview Yuan Yang." By that stage, I'd done my research and I said, "Shinran, she's very busy. She's a member of parliament. She's just been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. I don't think she's going to have a lot of time." And if any of you know Shinran, you know that Shinran is nothing if not supportive and persistent. And so I'd get these emails saying, "So, have you got in touch with Yuan Yang?" I'm like, "Oh, no, I haven't yet. She must be so busy." Anyway, push comes to shove, and I emailed you, Yuan. You very kindly responded, and here we all are. What I'm going to do, Yuan, is to take you back just because there will be people on the chat tonight who do know you and others who don't. So you haven't given you a chance to speak much, but you speak with a very English accent, and yet you were born in China. Is that correct?
Yes, I suppose to an Australian audience, it sounds extremely British, my accent. And I grew up in the UK. I came here when I was 4 years old with my parents who are from mainland China, and I was born in mainland China. So I spent the most of my life here in the UK up until the age of 25, when I went back to China, to Beijing, actually a city that I'd never lived in before, as an adult reporting for the Financial Times on China's economy. And the book Private Revolutions is partly a reflection of that particular period that I went back in, the end of the 2010s, the start of the pandemic. The for many Chinese people, that was the end of the kind of economic boom era. And so I'm trying to capture the transformation in society and the economic changes that had happened, but through the lens of these four women who are my main characters, real people in the book.
What I'm going to do is just share the screen for a moment. There are many people here are familiar with China, but there are those that aren't. And we're going to be talking about the book, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about you, Yuan. And so I'm just got a map of China with its provinces, and also a smaller map which deals with the southern part of China, so the Guangdong province. Now, just focusing on you first of all, Yuan, before we turn to the people that you've written about in Private Revolutions. So, Where were you born? Where did you live as a young child? And then where did you return to?
So I'm really glad that you've got this pictorial aid, and I think it would have helped with many of the talks I've given on this subject. I was born actually on the East Coast, so just south of Shanghai, where it says Zhejiang, in a university town, which is where my parents were working when I was born. My parents were academics at the time. But before the age of one, I then traveled. So it's a 2-day, 2-night train, or it was at that time. Um, from that part of the East Coast almost directly west into Sichuan province, the orange province on the map. And that very long journey was to take me to my grandparents' home, my maternal grandparents' home. And they looked after me until the age of 4. And so that journey transferred me almost into the cohort of my generation of what are called left behind children. It's quite a pejorative term. Um, of children who are brought up in many ways in kind of in villages or in the kind of rural homelands of their grandparents because their parents are out working. And I had a great experience of my childhood in the Sudanese mountain town that my grandparents lived in. But I had quite a different experience because my parents of course, were quite highly educated. My grandparents were educated as well, and they brought me up to be really interested in telling stories, reading stories to me, and making creative stories as well was a really big part of my childhood. At that point, my parents, my father had then moved to the UK, and then later my mum and I joined my dad in the UK. When I was 25, I then went to Beijing in the north, a completely different part of China. And in many ways, what I would like the book to show to readers is how China has many different countries within a country almost in terms of the culture, the even the food, the cuisine, the climate, and there are many different Chinas within one country.
And yet, the China that you knew as a child, you left it for, and then you came to England. Did you come with fluent English as a 4-year-old?
Oh, not at all. I mean, the I often joke that I probably wasn't even fluent in standard Mandarin because I spoke a very Sichuanese kind of dialect of Mandarin with my grandparents and everyone else living in the kind of mountain town that we were living in. But as soon as we arrived in the UK, of course, I was flung into this English language context. And sometimes I look back at my primary school kind of notebooks and with my where my mum and I were in many ways learning English at the same rate. So one of the things that my primary school teachers assigned to us as a kind of homework was to read primary school, books, storybooks with to our parents. And for children of English speaking families, that's, of course, your parents are giving you practice in the language. But for my family, it was as much practice for my mum as it was for me. So I have a very strong connection to my mum. And I think in many ways, we almost grew up together in the English speaking context and we learnt from each other.
Your parents were academics, and you went on to have quite an academic career. You studied at Oxford and you studied philosophy, politics, and economics. What drew you to that? You said when we began the interview that you're a storyteller. Um, is there storytelling in this? Why those subjects? Why that degree?
I suppose I think this is where the influence I think of class is really complex and interesting. And as I mentioned, in China, as part of a generation of left behind children who are generally quite disadvantaged because of their experiences um, with less access to education in the countryside. But I had the privilege of having quite educated family members who were looking after me. And in the UK, similarly, my parents came to the UK basically with their suitcases without savings and without money, but they also had the experience of education back in China and had the values that I would then inherit in terms of giving me the time and space and support to encourage me to continue my education. So I grew up with a lot of books in the household. My mum worked as a librarian on and off over the years, and she would often take me in the school holidays and kind of I would sit with her in the library and just kind of leaf through the books there. And I got really fascinated by philosophy books. And at the age of 14, 15, I remember thinking, I want to ask myself the really big questions about the world. And to me, that was about philosophy. And at the same time, I was also really into maths at school. I had some really inspirational maths teachers, and we also, had another part of me that said, well, I also want to develop this part of my interests. I had so many, as many teenagers do, so many overlapping interests and didn't really know what direction to take them in. And then I thought, well, if I study economics, then I'll be able to apply my maths, but to social questions. And that's why I ended up applying for philosophy, politics, and economics.
There are so many facets of your life that we could focus on, but what I want to do is focus mostly on your book today. One thing I did find interesting is that you said in an interview you intended to become a poet, but pivoted to journalism by accident. What a pivot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of I think in many people's careers, I think, are not something that can be planned in a linear fashion. I think each point in the last 15 years, I've pursued what spoke to me at the time, and kind of really invested in that, and it's led on to something else. So I've started writing poetry when I was a teenager, and there are a number of really great kind of government funded Arts Council run projects that brought together young writers, and I feel really indebted to all of those projects, and I'm still very much in touch with some of my former mentors from that time, because being involved in youth poetry and youth creative writing groups made me feel like I had creative license. I was for one of the groups I was part of, which is called the Yorkshire Young Writers Squad. The I was in one of the teachers introduced me to the group as, this is Yuan, she's one of our poets. Nobody had described me like that. I think I was 15, 16 when I joined that group. Nobody had described me like that at all with that kind of title. And I think for many aspiring writers, being given a platform and even a title, even if it's just somebody introducing you to a small group, it's really, really powerful because it makes you take your writing seriously. And I think taking your writing seriously is a really big step for most young writers. So poetry was my main form of writing. I wrote also short stories. And then in my mid-20s, I decided that I wanted the experience of working in I suppose the larger establishment, as it were, of the news media, and to write about economics. And so I went to The Economist, and that was the first experience I'd had of journalism. And then I moved from there to the Financial Times, where I stayed for 8 years and had most of my journalism career.
Last question before we turn to the book. You pivoted from poetry to journalism with poetry in the background and creative writing. And then suddenly you've become a member of Parliament, of the British Parliament. Now, the way I see politics, often it's people who have always wanted to be in
Mm.
politics or have wanted to be ambitious, have liked the power of it, or have a particular calling to it. What brought you into politics?
For me, it was partly generational, and my book explores how, we're shaped by the economic social conditions of our childhoods and the climate we grow up in. I came of age at the start of the onset of austerity in the UK, and the impact of the financial crisis very much was felt for me and all of those who graduated in the UK in the early 2010s as I did. And one of the first experiences I had of the impact of national politics on my life was the tripling of student fees, which happened when I was coming to the end of my university degree. And of course, that would then, we knew, lead to a higher burden of fees on the new students who are coming the following year. And that huge change, the end of the previous Labour government, the start of the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition government, the onset of austerity, and reducing funding to public services. That was the whole kind of turmoil in the context that I came of age in. And I think it's no surprise that many of my fellow Labour members of Parliament were politicised by that era of having to fight for having to fight for the kind of social infrastructure, for education, for access to all these different things around them. So I suppose that was the first part of it. And I think the second part was influenced in many ways by my time in China. I'd spent time, I think, interestingly, kind of looking at my home country, looking at the UK from a distance. And I think it's probably fair to say, this is probably a fairly, I think people of many different political persuasions would agree with me that the period that I was in China from 2016 to the end of the pandemic was not a great time for the UK. It wasn't a good time for us on the world stage, and it wasn't a good time for us domestically, in terms of the economy and our handling of COVID and so on. And I really had the strong feeling that we needed people to go in there and change things, which in a democratic system you have the ability to do as a British national, or indeed as Commonwealth nationals. There are also Australian members of Parliament as well in the UK. So that privilege was really highlighted to me by the contrast with the interviewees and my friends in China who often were doing quite amazing things and quite creative things within constraints to try to change their circumstances and try to improve the country. But there's very little voice, very few channels for you to pursue that in a systematic way in China.
People say that you can write about world events that involve millions of people and not have them touch the soul. But if you focus on an individual, or perhaps a couple or a few individuals, you understand the country through a way that is intimate and very instructive. This is what you've done in Private Revolutions. It's the story of four young women born and raised in China and how they negotiate the enormous changes that took place to the country as a whole and its economy over, I'd say, the past 30 years. Um, it's you've been writing poetry, short stories, a long and of course articles as a journalist. A long form book like this is quite an endeavour. What inspired you to do it?
I think there's a lot to what you just mentioned, the quote you just mentioned about about the big scale versus the human scale. And as an economics journalist, you're trying to write about a really large, complex macro system, and you try to capture that in statistics, in some anecdotes, but you're trying to capture something that's really above the eye level of most people. You're taking the bird's eye view in some ways. As a novelist or as a literary nonfiction writer, I was trying to capture the kind of human eye view of the situation. And a lot of the feedback that I'd had when I'd written longer form essays, more kind of narrative driven essays for the Financial Times from our readers, was that they really felt like that view illuminated the bird's eye view, the kind of stats and so on, of our news and analytical reporting. And the final kind of moment where I felt like it was really important I write this book was when one of the characters in the book, Sam, who I'd gotten to know over ever since actually I arrived in China. She is an activist. She was involved in labor organizing, and she had over the years I've known her gotten more and more involved. And in 2018, 2019, there was a big crackdown on student labor organizers in southern China. And there was a point where I thought, well, I wasn't sure, and Sam and I had this conversation. We weren't sure whether when we'd be able to see or speak to each other again. And at that moment, I really felt like a life like hers needed to be chronicled and needed to be told. And that was started me kind of putting together the different notes, fragments of poetry. I did write a poem to her at that point when I wasn't sure if I'd see her again. All of these different pieces in my scrapbook and started to create the backbone of the book.
And have you stayed in contact with Sam?
Yes, I have. Yes, and she's doing well. In fact, in the in the preface of the book, there's a little bit where I've kind of after writing the book and finishing the draft, I revisited, kind of updated the reader, as it were, about where their lives have taken them. And I love what you mentioned about how you created this platform during the pandemic as a kind of creative attempt to address the constraints that you were in at the time. Because I think one of the main themes running through the book and through my interviewees' lives is how creative they have been within their constraints. And so Sam is doing well. I think they're all doing quite well. I won't ruin the endings, but they are tremendously creative women. And I think in lots of reporting on China in particular, we have a really heavy understanding of the constraints, but I also want people to understand the creativity that can happen within them.
I'm going to just turn again to the map of China as we talk about as we talk about the four women that you've really highlighted and showcased in your book. First of all, I'm assuming that the names you have used are not the characters' real names or the women's real name. Is that right?
Yes, so they're all anonymized, and I've anonymized the areas that they're from to some extent. I can give you a broad overview if that's helpful. And partly and it's unfortunate that we have to anonymize their stories because I think, I mean, I've shown parts of their stories and sometimes in whole to each of the women, and I think they're stories that they can be proud of. I certainly feel proud to tell their stories on their behalf, but unfortunately, given the climate of censorship and the unpredictability of censorship, it's very difficult to know where the line is and how the line moves each day. So it's more the unpredictability of censorship that led me to anonymize their names and their backgrounds.
So, thank you. Out of interest, has the book been published in China or is it available
No, so
in China?
No, so it's not been translated into Chinese and it's not been published in China. A couple of reasons for that. One is around the safety of interviewees. That's one of the issues that they brought up when I was speaking to them about whether it would be accessible in China. And secondly, it's very difficult to publish books in China without going through quite a rigorous back and forth between editors and the original draft. And I know that for many of the academics, the economists that I know who've published in China. So I wanted the book to stay whole and intact, and I think that can only really happen sadly outside of China.
It's interesting just seeing you and Shinran on screen together. It's almost like, and I know how you feel about this, that Shinran has passed the baton to you in terms of chronicling the tales of women in China. Those of you who
Well,
don't know, in China, Shinran was a well-known presenter and commentator and journalist. And she would let the tapes run at night for women to write in to talk about their experiences. And this really is the generation before and the generation one, a second generation removed from the young women that you're talking about, Yuan Yang. So it feels to me like Private Revolutions is almost a sequel to The Good Women of China.
Well,
Is that
Shinran is a great inspiration, and I grew up reading her books when I was younger. So it's really wonderful to see you, Shinran, and thank you for all the encouragement and the impetus that you've given me and Suzanne over the years. I would say Shinran is very much still holding her baton and still producing creative output. I think maybe the sporting analogy I'd give is perhaps a peloton. You know, where there have been women who've come before us and they've taken the brunt of being the first creators of their generations. They've taken the force of the wind against them. And there are many more writers of my generation who are coming in behind, kind of following in that slipstream that has been created because there've been really strong, amazing women who've charted the way ahead of us.
I think Peloton is an excellent example or an excellent understanding of how writers can work together and support each other. And it's terrific that that's the experience you've had as well. The four women that you've spoken about, you spoke a little bit about Sam. I'd like to talk about June. June's story is a particularly uh, sad one, I think, in a lot of ways, and
Mm.
also a story of great resilience. Just tell me vaguely, where does June, first of all, how did you meet June? Or did you meet June?
Yes, so I met June when we were both living in Beijing. The story, of course, of her life doesn't start in Beijing. It starts in the southwestern countryside. So if you look at the orange province of Sichuan, Sichuan is in the southwest, and the kind of three provinces around it are all. That's kind of what Chinese people refer to when they say the southwest. Kind of similar mountainous landscape, quite rural. In the past, you know, some of those parts of China have been the most deprived rural parts of China. Although, you know, of course, deprivation is very complex, and there are pockets of that across China. But broadly speaking, that's the history and culture of the Southwest. Spicy food is another part of the Southwest that's very important. Similar dialect in those areas as well. And she was born in southwestern China in the mountainous rural part of the southwest in one of the poorest villages in the country. And from that village, she really made huge steps to, I think, escape the fate of women in her village. She wanted to pursue schooling for herself, which was quite radical for her time. I think even though she's similar age to me, At the time that she was born, the expectation was that she would carry on farming and probably leave school at the age of 15, 16. And she really kind of she was bitten by the bug to be curious and continue exploring, and she was constantly fascinated by what the world would be like outside of her village, which led her on a series of steps that eventually took her to the capital city in Beijing, where I met her.
And just generally, if possible, how did you meet her? How did you get to know her?
Oh, well, this would be quite a general response, but I met my interviews through quite a range of ways. So some of them I'd met. So, for example, Sam I'd met when I first got to China, and we had become friends over a long period of time. Others I'd met through asking around my network of interviewees and friends, saying I was thinking about writing this book project, and who do they think I should go and meet. So I actually met up with, I think, almost 2 dozen or so interviewees in the end. Some introduced by others. As a writer, as a journalist, I'm sure you can kind of empathize with how much when you start pushing the snowball down the hill, it starts kind of gathering pace. And so when I met with all of those different people, some of them, they weren't all women actually to begin with. It's quite interesting to note. I also met with men of that generation. I really had to whittle it down to whose stories I felt were the most compelling and who were the most able narrators of their own story. And one thing I really felt was that the ability of anyone kind of born, in the last 80 or so years of Chinese history, there's an amazing story that each person has to tell because simply of the radical change that's happened over that time. Everyone living today in China has grown through transformations that in the UK would have taken, the better half of 2 centuries. If you think about the time between the Industrial Revolution to post-industrialization in the UK, that spanned, 8, 10 generations over 2 centuries. In China, that spanned 3 generations over around 40, 50 years. So everyone has got a great story, but not everyone is able to narrate their story. And I, in particular, was looking for women who had the ability to really narrate the intimate, self-aware parts of their story and to be able to kind of bring up that memory from when they were walking in the mountains at the age of 5 with their big sister, how they felt at that point, how they have changed over time. Because I really wanted to chart how social transformation, how economic transformation changes people at the really personal, intimate level. And June was one of the really self-aware narrators of her own story, and that's why she's one of the 4 women in this book.
And that leaves a lot of other people who you've interviewed and whose stories you know, but didn't make it into the book. What's next? Are there some people within those interviewees that gave you their story that you would like to use elsewhere?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've kept in touch with many of the interviewees who are not in the book, and I'm sure their stories will carry on developing. I feel like I feel like this book came out of a time when I was really immersed in Chinese society and in the changes of Chinese society, and I really wanted to be on the ground reporting the book out by visiting the women not only in the big cities where they lived, but also going back to their rural villages and spending time kind of with their mothers, their grandmothers, their extended family. So I don't think I would write another book about China at distance now that I'm firmly based here in the UK. But would love to write more in future. And I still keep a notebook, as I'm sure many writers do. And as you know, often you don't know what your notebook is going to inspire you when you read it again in a year or two's time.
I'm very mindful of your time, Yuan, and I'm sorry to everybody to whom I promised a question center, a question time. That will have to be for another time, because we've reached the time, and I think it's important for you to get back to your work, Yuan. Um, you do have some recommendations for us. So what we do with all the guests I have on Thursday Book Club, they come with some recommendations for us that I'll then put in the newsletter.
Thank you, Suzanne. So my recommendation is Fierce Attachments by Vivian Gornick. So it's a slim volume, and Vivian Gornick I think is one of my favorite memoirists, and I've been reading a lot of female memoir. In some ways, my book was kind of a memoir written on behalf of these four women. And one of the things that she explores really deeply here is her relationship with her mother and her mother's friends growing up. And it's just an amazingly self-reflective book, I would say, and really kind of instructive to anyone who is interested in the format of memoir.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Was there a second book that you'd like, or we'll leave it with one?
So a second book, I'm trying to think of so actually there's one I'll just reach up and bring it down because I want to show people the writing, but another work from I suppose the from the diaspora, as it were, from Huasu, called Stay True, is also very much a kind of coming of age book. And it's about his time at university. And it also won the Pulitzer Prize in memoir a couple of years ago. It's partly about his Taiwanese American family, but I won't spoil the story and just tell you to read the book itself.
And my last question for you, Yuan, what are your dreams for the next 2, 3, 4 years for yourself, for the country, for the world? You pick.
Oh gosh, big dreams. I mean, I think the first thing is to build something that's sustainable. I think that's really important. I think longevity and sustainability are really important. And I won the election for last year for this seat, this constituency in Reading, and I would really like to build it into a constituency that I can win again and again by making sure that people here are served by the things that my team and I do. So I think longevity and sustainability, I think are the other watchwords for me over the next few years. I think renewal is another watchword because, as I mentioned, since I was an adult, the UK's fortunes on the international and domestic stages have been really poor, and I think there is so much creativity and talent here in Reading, but also in the country overall. It's really about creating the infrastructure that enables people to express and make the most use of their capacities. So I think renewal at the national level is something as well.
And I think it's the most delightful combination to have a politician who has such an interest and expertise in economics, but is also a creative storyteller and a poet, because I do think that the arts are so important in telling stories and in making things better. So it's been such a joy to have you, Yuan. Thank you so much for your time. And
Thank you, Suzanne.
wish you a
Yeah.
good week. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.